Welcome to this episode of the Essential Church Podcast, an ongoing conversation about some of the most important issues facing the local church today. I'm your host, Andrew Arndt, and today I'm going to take you to an interview that I just did with a dear friend of mine, Chase Replogle. He is a pastor of Bent Oak Church in Springfield, Missouri, and he's a member of the doctoral cohort that I'm part of at Western Theological Seminary. That's how I got to know him. And he released a book earlier this year called The 5 Masculine Instincts, which is, just to say it up front, this is not just another book on how to be a better man. There's so much going on in our culture about masculinity. Either we're baptizing certain forms of masculinity, or we're just deconstructing it left and right, and we assume that any kind of masculinity is automatically toxic. And Chase's approach, and I say this in the podcast, but Chase's approach is completely fresh and completely unique. It's neither assuming that masculinity is salvific, nor is it toxic, but it's something else. It's something that's subject to the sanctifying work of the Spirit, which is what we talk about in the interview. I think that you're really going to enjoy this. If you're a guy out there, if you're a pastor out there, I think you need to lean into this conversation and maybe consider having Chase come out and speak to your men at some point. But without further commentary from me, here's the conversation. All right, well, we're here today with my friend Chase Replogle. Chase is the pastor of Bent Oak Church in Springfield, Missouri, and the author of the book, The 5 Masculine Instincts, which I read not too long ago. I know Chase because we are in the same doctoral program up at Western Theological Seminary, the Sacred Art of Writing. And so we've gotten to know each other a little bit over the last year and some change. And I think it was just about when the program was starting, you had just released The 5 Masculine Instincts. Is that right, Chase?
Yeah, it's been out since March of this year, so a little over 6 months now.
Oh, that's great. Okay, well, I read it. Okay, then it was after the spring intensive, I think. I grabbed a copy of it and read it on the flight home, and I loved every single page of this book. And I think, given the cultural climate that we live in and all of the debate and the rancor surrounding masculinity, toxic masculinity, I think that anybody that wades into these waters is a brave person or a crazy person, or they just feel called by the Lord to do it. So, Chase, I'm so eager to talk with you about your book. But before we get into it, I have got to know, tell our listeners, why this book? Why did you write it? Tell us the story.
Yeah, well, so first and foremost, I'm a pastor, which means I've got a congregation full of men, and I've watched over the last few years as you sort of already set up well, how it's become really a controversial conversation. Even as a pastor, you feel like you're sort of navigating landmines just by bringing up the topic. And I've seen that one of the effects of it has been people are just less comfortable talking about or even asking the question, what does it mean for me to be a man? What does it mean for me to be a Christian man? And I saw the way that a lot of the men in my congregation were wrestling with those questions and struggling to find answers. And there's certainly all sorts of places it's being talked about in culture. And I was seeing them find very different answers to those questions. And so I wanted to try to create a book, a conversation that might give us a path out of the sort of existing trenches, the existing arguments, and offer a path towards a better conversation about character. What does it mean to grow in Christ-like character as a man? And is it possible to sort of avoid some of the controversy and actually just become better men, more like Christ through the process? So it was my way of trying to navigate those conversations pastorally and then offer those conversations to readers more broadly.
Well, I think that you do it brilliantly. And what I love about your book is I think that what we see, and you name this in your book, but I think that what we see in approaches to trying to get masculinity right is we either assume that there are certain traits that all men should have. And then we go, okay, now guys, you need to rise up into these traits. And so as you say, we either make sort of traditional masculinity salvific in some way, or we look at traditional masculinity and we go, well, look, all of those things are responsible for the great evils of our world. And so we automatically name it toxic or destructive in some way. But your approach is such a different approach. So I wonder if you could talk to us for a couple minutes here about what your approach really is, because I found it so incredibly refreshing and very helpful.
Yeah, well, you're right. These two sort of cultural ways of having the conversation are either we need to deconstruct traditional masculinity toxic masculinity, reframe it, or your raw masculine instincts is your salvation. You need to indulge those with a kind of wild abandon. And the thing that strikes me, as different as those two things are, the thing that they have in common is they both really are paying attention to external things, external behaviors, external traits. And it's as if we believe that if we throw enough marketing money and slogans and PR campaigns at men, we'll somehow produce better men. And that's fundamentally, I don't think it's the Christian message, and I just don't think it works. I think the real message is we become better from our heart outward. Our behavior flows out of what's happening internally. And unfortunately, the cultural debates pay very little attention to the internal realities of a man. So I use the language of instincts in the book. I take C.S. Lewis's definition of an instinct as behavior as if from knowledge. So there are ways we behave and act as men that seem to us like common sense, that may even seem like we've decided, when in reality, we've just never paid much attention to them. One of the lines from the book that seems to get a lot of underlines is, we become experts at what's wrong with the world, but are still amateurs at what's wrong with us.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the controversy is actually, it's atrophying our ability to grow as men. We've got to take that conversation to an internal place and say, what are those instincts or desires that are motivating my behavior? How do I check them and mature them into something that produces a better, more Christ-like life and character?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I find so refreshing about it, is that you're naming what I think, they're instincts I think that most men have. Even if they don't, it's okay. But given the fact that most men have these, you're not saying, hey, these are great, indulge these things, nor are you saying these are automatically awful. What you're saying is our instincts, such as they are, need to be sanctified by the Spirit, or else they will go awry and we won't rise up into what God is wanting us to be. Is that an accurate kind of assessment of what you're trying to say?
I'm always really careful to say these instincts are not the 5 sins of men. You know,
That's
you
right.
better watch out for these things.
Right.
Nor are they the 5 expectations of men. You have to have these to qualify as a man.
Yep.
I actually take the instincts from one of Shakespeare's famous monologues. It opens, everybody knows the opening, all the world's a stage, and each of us, men and women, have our entrance and our exits. And Shakespeare goes on to describe these stages within a man's life. Shakespeare being one of the great kind of psychological writers of history, right? Trying to get at human nature. And so he depicts these images in a man's life from what we would imagine. Well, he begins with birth and death. I take the middle 5. So what we would imagine like a school age boy all the way through to kind of retirement years.
Yeah.
So what I did was try to take each of those Shakespearean images, use a biblical character or story to help you see how that instinct is at work in the life of a man, and then help men ask questions about, is it possible that instinct is motivating behavior in my life, and how do I mature it into something useful instead of something that just might lead to destruction?
Can you talk through, and we're not going to, I want people to buy the book and read it. So we're not going to give away everything that's in it, but I would love it if you could just name those 5 instincts through those 5 stages, because I think that they're really helpful. That'll provide us a little bit of framework. And then I want to just I want to spend the time that we have remaining drilling into 2 of them, because you give a couple biblical examples of men and you give a reading of those guys that I think is really, really, really important for us to hear. So I want to have a conversation about those 2 guys. But give us those 5 kind of in a nutshell so that we can get a sense of what you're talking about.
Yeah, I'll give you kind of a sentence on each. So the first one is sarcasm. I use the story of Cain. Shakespeare describes it as the reluctant schoolboy who's reluctant to learn and grow and mature. So sarcasm.
Yep.
The second one is adventure. I use the story of Samson to look at this cultural narrative that to know who you are, you have to find yourself on a kind of epic quest. The third one I look at is ambition in the life of Moses. Shakespeare imagines this as the warrior who's ready to right every wrong, right? You're passionate about doing great things in the world, ambition. The fourth one is reputation. And I use the story of David to look at, Shakespeare has a great image. He says, we begin to dress the way we're expected. We start to put on a little extra weight. This is like the middle of life. You've achieved some things, and all of a sudden you start paying attention to protecting that reputation you've earned. And then the final one is apathy. I use the story of Abraham. Shakespeare has a great line where he says, the world has become too wide. That as we age, we tend to realize the complexities of life, and there's a tendency to withdraw from them in apathy. And so we look at that instinct in the life of Abraham.
Wild. Okay, well, I cannot wait for folks to get this book and read it, because I think that they'll be very helped by it. I want to drill down. I want to spend a couple minutes drilling down into the sarcasm one and the adventure one for a second here. And I loved your chapter on sarcasm, because I think, you talk about that as like, that's sort of the great instinct maybe, and also a great temptation of adolescent spirituality, or the adolescent years. What it made me think of, Chase, is how there's been so much analysis around the idea that we have extended adolescence now. It used to be that adolescence kind of ended at 18 and you went through some rites of passage and voila, you're an adult. And now, adolescence for a lot of guys is pushing into their late 20s, even into their 30s. There are some critical things that there are some critical growth, I think, tracks that they're not jumping over to getting into maturity. So I think that this has wide application, and I loved your reading of Cain. So we have at the beginning of the Bible, Genesis chapter 4, the Cain and Abel story, and you paint Cain as a really nice picture of kind of the sarcastic approach to life that locks the door to wisdom. So can you tell us kind of what you're saying about Cain and how that relates to kind of this sarcastic impulse that we have?
Yeah, sure. So Cain is kind of the archetypal firstborn child of creation, right? It's Adam and Eve's first son. So he is this first child of creation. So he's beginning this process of whatever it is to inherit a broken world and try to mature into it in this relationship with God. That's Cain's story. The big question every preacher, I'm sure you've dealt with it, every commentator has to deal with in the Cain and Abel passage is, why does God reject Cain's sacrifice and accept Abel's? And the truth is, the biblical passage is really vague about it. Mm-hmm. We can read between the lines. Maybe there's something with motivations or his heart, but it doesn't tell us. But what it does say is that God came down and initiated a conversation with Cain. Mm. It's not the first sin, but it's the first mention of sin in the Bible when he tells Cain, don't you realize that sin is crouching at your door and its desire is to rule over you if you don't master it? Mm-hmm. I take this as something pretty profound, that Cain and his frustration at his sacrifice having been rejected, God comes down and begins a conversation. And the thing that you would imagine Cain would do is turn to God and say, why? That's the question every commentator and preacher wants to know. Why did you reject my sacrifice? But Cain doesn't do it. God comes down with this warning, and what does Cain do? He doesn't respond to God. He reacts impulsively, murders his brother. When God shows back up a second time and says, where's your brother Abel? Then you get this little quip of sarcasm. Am I my brother's keeper? Well, Cain knows exactly where his brother is and exactly what happened to him. And you see it pretty clearly that what is kind of a witty, clever answer is really just a thin veil, a cover for his contempt for God, his contempt for authority. That Cain really has before him a remarkable opportunity. The God of the universe is willing to explain to you the kind of sacrifice he's looking for and how you went wrong and how you can overcome sin. I mean, this divine lesson is really pretty remarkable. But because of his immaturity and his inability to be challenged or checked, Cain finds himself instead reactive, impulsive, sarcastic, biting back at God's contempt, his lesson, and in the end ends up kind of perpetually immature. I mean, the final image of Cain is that he's wandering in the land of Nod being the land of wandering, that he ends up this kind of lost adolescent, adrift, without real direction to his life.
Give us some. I love that, and I hope that our listeners caught that. And I thought that was, you helped me read that story with new eyes. The question that any reader of that text asks is, what is the deal? Why are you rejecting Cain's sacrifice? And it's the one question that he doesn't ask, and that's really the point of the narrative, is that he doesn't become inquisitive about what God really wants from him. Give us a couple examples, Chase, of where you're seeing this happening with guys in our culture.
Yeah, well, I think there is certainly a sense right now, a general defensiveness around masculinity, that if anybody questions you, if anybody points out something in your life, there's this knee-jerk reaction to sort of defend ourselves, right? So to anything that I perceive as confrontation, well, I'm immediately going to put up my defenses and refuse to receive it. There's also this kind of general attitude in life that makes everything a joke, right? So anytime something serious comes up, I can quickly sort of laugh at it, make a joke at it as a way of not having to deal with it or face it, both in the world and also within myself. And so I think I would say to men, if you find yourself struggling to take things seriously, if you find yourself unwilling to let anyone in this world challenge you, or you feel immediately defensive and reactionary when somebody points to something in your life, it's possible that God could be using those things to mature you into a better man. But if you're unwilling to open that door, I use the definition in the book of humility as self-suspicion, right? If you're not willing to have a moment in which you say, perhaps I'm wrong, perhaps I have something I could learn here, that little cracked door of self-suspicion is the invitation to allow God to begin to teach and guide and correct. That really is that path towards maturity. And without it, we end up sort of stuck in this immaturity, unable to perceive the divine lesson.
Yes. I think it was Socrates that said the unexamined life is not worth living. And I think that's what you're inviting guys into, is begin to examine what's going on in your life. I wonder if you could just comment on this for a second, because when I read this chapter, the thing honestly that I thought about, Chase, was I thought about the level of anger and vitriol that we see coming from men when their political cause or their social cause is not working the way that they wanted it to. And so rather than engaging in a posture of self-examination, hey, I wonder why this isn't working, what we immediately do is we start pointing the finger at the other side. I wonder if you could just remark on that for a second. Do you think that at all has anything to do with what you're trying to argue for in this chapter?
Yeah, I think men, but all of us, need to be able to be able to hold the idea that perhaps I'm wrong.
Yeah.
Maybe what I have perceived and thought and feel so passionate about, maybe I'm not right.
Yeah.
Now, oftentimes you will be right. I'm not suggesting every thought you ever have is wrong.
That's
Certainly,
right.
There's probably plenty of things that you're right about. But the ability to pause for a moment and consider, am I right about this? Or to turn that into a moment of prayer and say, God, are you trying to teach me something in this moment that I've rushed past and missed?
Yeah.
That little cracked door is the invitation for everything that God wants to do in our life and everything better that we have the potential to become as men. We don't become better by sort of refusing any of the lessons, right? Charging ahead with our first thought, our first instinct, our first impulse. Every moment of growth is really in some way a moment of humbling ourselves and entertaining, could I be wrong, and could there be a lesson here that God's trying to lead me into? So yeah, if you find yourself almost immediately sparked to anger or frustration or irritation, there's probably a sign there that there's more going on within you that you've not taken a moment to pause and look at and invite God in to help give you insights and possibly mature beyond. Again, you might be technically right, but if you can't entertain the fact that you could be wrong, well, you're definitely not maturing, even though you may be holding a correct position.
Right. Yeah. And I also, as we're talking, it makes me think about, there are a lot of the folks that listen to our podcast are church leaders, pastors. And I think about all of the leaders. One of the great temptations, I think, of leadership is that we just get angry and frustrated with our people because they're not behaving the way that we want them to behave. And so we've prayed about things and we have good strategies and plans. And now why aren't people responding to what I want them to do and the way that the Lord is leading us? And I think that your book is a good reminder to us that if and when we feel the impulse towards anger and finger pointing, blaming, I think that we've got an adolescent impulse on our hands and it's time to have that sanctified. Just listen a little bit better. Pay attention to what the Spirit is actually doing in your congregation, and you might stand a chance of participating in the great work of God. So I'm going to pivot off of that into the second instinct, which I love so much, which is, as you call it, the instinct to adventure. And the person that you talk about, the biblical character, is Samson. And you give this great reading. And Samson is actually another good example of, like Cain, he kind of missed something that God was trying to say to him. And so you have this reading of the moment when Samson tore apart the lion with his bare hands and then came upon the carcass again. Take us into that for our listeners here and help us see where Samson was missing the voice of God.
Yeah, so in many ways, Samson's story are these little adventure cycles that build on each other. There's multiple little stories that are each a kind of adventure. Samson wanders off to some foreign place. He finds himself in trouble. The Spirit rushes over him. The strength rescues him. And then there's a question of what does he do, having received that divine help? And in the first of those, you're right, he tears apart this lion with his bare hands. And then we read that sometime later he passes back by, and as perhaps men are prone to do, he turns to relive his glory day, right? He wants to go see where it all happened again. And he finds the carcass of this lion laying there. And the Hebrew is really interesting. It's subtle, but it could be translated, and in the ruin of the lion, there was a congregation of bees and this honey. And I think that it's a kind of symbolic sign the Spirit has given him, that in the same way you've destroyed this lion, and in its place, in its ruin, this hive of bees, this community of bees exists, that in the same way, by this strength, you'll bring down the Philistines and in their ruin, create a place for Israel to live in safety, this land flowing with milk and honey. But what does Samson do with this divine sign? Well, he completely misses it. He scrapes the honey out and begins to eat it, violating one of his Nazirite vows. And then he ends up at a drunken wedding party with the Philistines, and he turns the whole experience into a drunk pun that he gambles over, right? And this is that cycle that plays out over and over in Samson's life. He has this divine experience in the midst of adventure, but instead of it enlightening him or making him somehow sense who he is in some grander way, over and over, he just indulges it and loses it. He becomes less discerning. He gets nothing out of it. And that plays itself larger and larger until eventually that moment with Delilah, when I think he almost gives away his secret as a way of being done with it at all. He's exhausted of this never-ending cycle of adventure that just never quite pays off, that never leads to something better. And so I use the chapter to say, again, there's nothing wrong with adventure. I like going and doing things as much as anyone else. But if it becomes a sort of habitual practice where you're constantly looking for identity and meaning through adventure, and you're finding yourself constantly restless from it, and it's beginning to weaken your commitments to place and family and marriage and vocation, then perhaps you're putting something on adventure that it's never going to be able to deliver. And I think that's certainly what plays out in Samson's life.
Yeah, I mean, there's a difference between adventure for adventure's sake and adventure because duty calls for it. The responsibilities and obligations of life call for it. And what you see in Samson is this kind of, as you argue, it's an addiction to adventure. Tell me where you're seeing that in our culture. Tell me where you're seeing that with our guys.
Yeah, well, I mean, I know this one firsthand, like most of us. You know, you turn 28, 29, maybe 30, and all of a sudden you're in a cubicle job and you've got a car payment and a mortgage and 2 kids and a dog to feed. And you're looking around thinking, I love all of this, but this isn't quite as adventurous as I imagined it all playing out to be. And there's a kind of real restlessness that can set in for men where they start feeling like all of this is holding me back, place and tradition and family, and it's costing me who I actually am. I think this is be on the lookout. This is one of the big narratives in almost all of the movies and stories around us right now, right? To know who you truly and uniquely are, you have to leave place and family and tradition and faith and go find your unique self. And that doesn't work for Samson.
That's right.
I argue instead what you need is a kind of commitment that leads to discernment to recognize what God is already doing around you. You'll love, there's this piece of advice a poet gave to another poet who was complaining about his life not being interesting enough to draw from for his poetry.
Yeah.
And the older poet said, don't blame your life for being boring. Blame yourself for not being poet enough to recognize the meaning in it.
Yes.
And I think that's one of the high callings of being a follower of Christ is we cultivate a kind of discernment that allows us to recognize the good things that God is doing and what we might imagine to be boring or dull or uninteresting, that often those are the very places that God is at work growing us and shaping us and doing good things, if we can just cultivate the discernment through commitment to recognize it.
It's really going to bother me if I don't ask you this. So who was the poet that said that? Was that Rilke?
Yeah, that's the one.
Okay,
So in his book.
Yes, all right. My poetry cred remains. You and I, Chase, I want you to talk a little bit more about that because you and I are both in the same really stage in life. You know, we're in our 40s. We've been pastoring for a while. We have slayed some dragons along the way. Now there's institutional responsibility that's coming to us and the call of duty and fidelity to place and to our commitments. I wonder if you could just talk candidly about the things right now, because this is where a lot of pastors, a lot of men go sideways. They've got things are settled. They're okay. They're paying the bills. They're doing fine. But their thirst for adventure, if that's not sanctified, it'll really lead them into trouble. So I just wonder if you could talk candidly about what you're doing, how you're handling that thirst for adventure in your heart. What are you doing to stay grounded in place and commitment?
Yeah, I think this is an area where, in many ways, the whole book is based on the idea of wisdom versus adventure good, adventure bad. It's really a question of paying closer attention to your own life. Look, within Christianity over the last couple decades, there's been plenty of Christians promoting adventure as the solution to what men need, right? So we've got to wake men up from their apathy, and they need to look at their life in terms of a kind of adventurous narrative. And there's certainly a place for that. I write about apathy at the end of the book. But my experience has been, and knowing my own heart as well, I tend to want that adventure too much. I tend to find it weakening my commitment to place. And so for me, it's been an intentional practice of saying, well, I'll tell you, maybe this seems a bit silly to you, but I like to turkey hunt. I was sitting out in the woods on my 30th birthday, and I remember thinking to myself, I don't know the names of any of these birds, like the songbirds that are around me in the bushes. I've grown up in Missouri my whole life. I'm sitting here, I'm listening to them for hours because I'm not getting a turkey. And I thought, I don't know the names of the things that are around me. Yeah. Or another experience I had was we were on, this is a good Colorado story. We were on the public gondola in Telluride, Colorado, going up to the ski resort. Beautiful elk grazing beneath us, waterfall at the end of the box canyon. And there's a lady on the going up with us who lives at the ski resort. And so she was obviously very wealthy. You could tell from the way she was dressed. And we got talking. She asked where we were from. And I said, Springfield, Missouri. She said, is that near Branson, Missouri? And I said, yeah, I'm about 30 minutes from Branson. And she said, my husband and I love Branson. We vacation there every year. We think it's the most beautiful place in the country. Now, she lives at the place I'm vacationing, the ski resort in Telluride.
Right.
I still think it's absurd,
Yes.
right? But it was this really profound moment in my life where I had this realization. People come to where I live to vacation and I go to where they live to vacation. What do they see in the place that I'm in that I've grown so accustomed to that I don't see it anymore? And is it possible for me to be intentional about seeing those things again? So I bought a book on birds and I started learning the names of the birds that are in the bushes around me. I started trying to pay closer attention to what are things in this area that I've just not done or explored before. So how do I begin to see the things that are meaningful, even in this life around me, that in my need for bigger adventures, I've begun to miss, I've begun to overlook? And so those are little things, but that disposition, that sort of way of looking at the world around me became really important for me to start embracing. It's probably the reason I'm still pastoring in the same place, 10 years later, is just a deepening commitment to the place that I am and trying to discern what God is doing there.
It strikes me that it's probably been really helpful for your pastorate too. I think a lot of pastors in their search for adventure, they're disrupting the framework of their congregations because it's got to be bigger and better all the time. And it's pulling congregational life all out of whack. So maybe if you just go on the assumption that the boundary lines have fallen for you in pleasant places and you have a delightful inheritance, maybe there's just plenty of adventure inside those boundary lines, which is one of the things that I love about you. Like, you're curious about your life. And you guys are always like, you throw yourself passionately into hobbies. Like when we were on our UK trip recently, you talked about sailing and you throwing yourself into that. It also made me think about Eugene Peterson talking about how in the middle years of his life, after the congregation was set and stable, he just had a lot of excess energy that he needed to burn off. And so he started running marathons. And that was really just him kind of satisfying that need for adventure inside a hobby and inside a framework that was actually healthy for him. So I think there's a lot of wisdom in what you're saying. Chase, we're about out of time. So what I'd love for you to do is just now talk directly to pastors. And as a pastor to pastors, what are you doing? Like when you're thinking about the guys in your congregation, give us some key things that you're doing to disciple the men in your congregation. What should we be thinking about as leaders?
Yeah, I would say listen to the men. There's a tendency right now to just talk at men and tell men what the problems are and what needs to be fixed. So show the men in your congregation a willingness to just listen to what it is they're experiencing, how they're processing it, what they're thinking about. Recognize that a lot of the things men are thinking about, the podcasts they're listening to, the YouTube channels they're following, the big questions they're thinking about in life are probably not the things you've normally associated with men's ministry or with the church. Every young man I know is talking about aliens and psilocybin, hallucinogens, and there's this whole list of things that men have questions about that are just completely off the radar for most of us as pastors. So think about those things. They're listening to hours of content around it. So pay attention to those things. But I would say more than anything else, I think the thing that we have to say to men right now is just it's possible to be better. I think we've unfortunately communicated to men that look, they're just problems to be fixed. They're problems to be safeguarded and problems to be kept at arm's length. We've caught it all up in the controversy of our day. It's in the politics of our day. It's in the cultural conversations. And so just to say to the men, particularly in that small setting of actual relationships in a congregation, that through Christ, it's possible just to become better, to be a better man, to be a better father, to be a better husband. You're not destined to just be addicted to things and lazy in recliners and absorbed in your own adventures. It's possible to grow beyond those things through Christ. I think that's the message men need to hear more than anything. And one of the things that shocked me about the book was the number of people who have reached out and said thank you, that they were just grateful that the book didn't feel like it was condemning men, but it was offering them a path forward. And it made me realize just again how much men need that, just an encouragement. There is a path forward. It's not a path of controversy. It's the path behind Christ as he leads us towards a better manhood.
Well, you do a brilliant job of that. And you've created, before I forget and we're done, you've created a couple ancillary resources to go along with this. Can you tell us about those real quick?
Yeah, so anybody listening, the 5masculineinstincts.com, there's an online assessment there. It's nothing scientific, but it'll ask you some questions and help you maybe discern which of these instincts is strongest. And then there's material around those, so YouVersion reading plans for each one. If you're interested in using it in a group setting, there's a PDF study guide as well as a video series through each chapter of the book. And the contact form goes right to me, so if you've got questions or any way I could be helpful as well, feel free to shoot me an email. I'd love to hear from you.
That's great. We'll include all of that in the show notes. The author is Chase Replogle. The book is so good, The 5 Masculine Instincts. And Chase is, you've heard him, he's a brilliant speaker, brilliant thinker. So if you got a men's event coming up, a little retreat happening, holler at Chase. I'm sure he'd love to come out and hang with your guys. Chase, good to have you. Thanks for being with us today.